You ever know someone who just disappeared from the world? Not in the dramatic way, not the kind you see on missing posters, but slowly, quietly, like smoke slipping out a cracked window. Levi Boone was that kind of man. Out past the ridgeline, where the snow still clung to the ground long after town had thawed, he lived alone. No visitors, no calendar, no clock but the land itself. He didn't need to know what day it was, he could read it in the earth. When the snow line inched back toward the peaks each morning, he knew spring was coming. When the mud cracked beneath his boots by mid-April, he knew the thaw had passed. When the mule's winter coat began to shed in tufts that stuck to the fence posts like forgotten memories, he knew time was moving on, whether he was ready or not. But Levi? He'd stopped keeping up a long time ago. His world had narrowed to the ranch, the fence line, the stubborn pump at the creek, the barn with its slouching roof. You could tell the place used to matter once. You could see it in the way the beams still held together, like they remembered someone cared about them. And maybe Levi used to care too. Maybe before the war, before his brother, before the silence stretched out longer than the conversations ever did. He wasn't bitter, just worn. Worn down by years where no one knocked and no one answered if they did. I don't know if you've ever been that alone. I don't mean the kind of alone where your phone doesn't buzz for a day. I mean real alone, where your own voice sounds strange when you finally use it, where days slip past and nothing interrupts them, except maybe the wind or the sound of hooves on frozen ground. That's where Levi was. And then, one morning, something changed. He was working the outer fence that day. Weather had turned mild, the ground just thawed enough that it clung to his boots like wet bread. His knuckles were raw from hammering old cedar posts back into the ground. And in the middle of that quiet, in the middle of a world that had asked nothing from him for years, he noticed the crows. Circling. Low. Not high like they did when they rode the wind. No, this was low. Tight. Just above the tree line behind the barn. And Levi knew. That usually meant death. Or something close. He figured it was a carcass. Coyote, maybe. Or a deer that had wandered too far and met something sharper than itself. He didn't expect a man. Lying there at the base of the trees, slumped like he'd folded into the earth itself, was an old native man. Skin dark with dirt and dried blood, a broken arrow lodged deep in his side. His chest moved, barely. His breath was shallow. He wasn't dead, but the distance wasn't far. And Levi, he stood there. Just stood, rifle still on his back, jaw tight. Didn't move, didn't speak. Because this wasn't what he'd signed up for. He didn't want strangers on his land, and especially not tribal strangers. Nothing good ever came from mixing into old grudges and invisible lines. But the man was breathing. Just barely. So Levi dropped to one knee, pressed two fingers to his neck, found a pulse, thin and slow, but present. He looked around, no other riders, no sound but wind in the brush. He cursed under his breath, stood up, and started dragging the man uphill. It wasn't kindness. Levi would have told you that straight. It was instinct. Something older than logic. Something buried in the ribs. And maybe, just maybe, it was a piece of the man he used to be. The one who hadn't walked away when others were bleeding. He brought the man into the barn, laid him down in the straw. The mule brayed once, but didn't move. Levi rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Boiled water, found a bottle of whiskey, dug out old rags, and used a skinning knife that hadn't touched hide in months. The man groaned once, but never opened his eyes. Levi didn't speak, didn't pray, just worked. And in that quiet, something shifted. Because after years of silence, of moving through days without anyone else in them, Levi Boone had to make room. Not for a conversation, not even for gratitude, but for a dying man, half frozen, half conscious, who shouldn't have survived that far at all. And maybe that's where this story really begins. Not with the war Levi came from or the grief he carried like gravel in his boots, but with the moment he stopped living only for himself, even if he didn't know it yet. Because when someone enters your silence, even without words, it doesn't stay silent for long. And Levi's silence, it had just been interrupted.
You ever see something that doesn't make sense right away? Just a flicker out of the corner of your eye, but deep down you know it means something's wrong? That's what it was like for Levi Boone that morning. He was out working the fence again, same as always. Same slow rhythm of hammering nails into old cedar, his hands raw from the cold and the wood. The kind of work you do, not because it ever really gets done, but because it keeps you from thinking too much. And then he saw the crows. Not high, circling the sky like they usually did. These were low, tight circles, just above the trees near the back of the barn. Not many things bring crows that close to the ground, except something dead. Or dying. Levi stood still for a second, chewing on the wind like it might tell him what waited out there. He figured it was an animal. Maybe a coyote wandered too close and didn't make it back out, or a deer caught in barbed wire and bled out in the brush. But whatever it wasn't good. Nothing that draws crows ever is. He left the fence half-fixed and started up the hill, boots sinking into the thawing ground. The air had that damp, early spring smell, wet roots, old leaves, something sour hiding beneath the dirt. He kept one hand near the rifle slung across his back, not out of fear, just habit. And there, just past the tree line, he found him. A man, lying still in the dirt like the earth had grown tired and was trying to pull him back in. Levi blinked, took a step closer. The man was older, native. His skin looked like it hadn't been washed in days, and dried blood had cracked like bark across his chest. A broken arrow was jutting from his left side, snapped at the shaft. It didn't look like a clean hit. Looked like it'd been there a while. The guy wasn't dead. Not yet. But his breath came in those ragged, fluttering pulls like someone who's halfway between this world and the next. Levi stood over him, silent. Now here's the thing about Levi. He wasn't the kind of man to rush. Not anymore. He'd seen too many things happen too fast, and most of them ended with someone not breathing by the time help arrived. So he scanned the tree line first, looked for tracks, riders, any hint that whoever had done this might still be close. Nothing. Just wind in the old brush. Just the crows, still watching. And right then, Levi didn't want this. Didn't want a stranger on his land. Didn't want the weight of someone else's fight crossing into his silence, especially not a tribal wound. Those don't heal clean, and they sure don't come without someone coming to finish what they started. But even so, he knelt beside the man, pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse, barely. Skin was cold, clammy. The wound stank of infection, bad. Too bad to have just happened. Whatever this man had been running from, he'd been running a while. Crawled maybe, all the way through the trees, all the way to here. Levi exhaled through his teeth, looked around again. Still nothing. Still no one coming. So, he grabbed the man under the arms and started to drag him. Not because he was feeling noble, not because he thought it was his responsibility. He did it the way you might cover up a fallen dog when winter comes, the way you might bury a stranger without asking who they were, just because someone had to. It wasn't kindness. It was instinct. Maybe a little mercy, too. He brought him to the barn, laid him down in the straw near the back where it was dry. The mule gave a confused little noise but didn't move. Levi rolled up his sleeves, set the stove going, got out the whiskey, the boiled water, some rags, found his old skinning knife. He worked slow, careful, cut the vest open, dug the arrow shaft out, poured whiskey into the wound. The body jerked hard once, then went still again. No screaming, just silence. Levi wrapped the wound tight, hands steady. He didn't talk while he did it, didn't pray, didn't curse, just kept his jaw tight and his eyes focused. When it was done, he sat back on his heels, looked at what he'd done. The man wasn't going to die just yet. He didn't know if that was a good thing or not. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a preacher, wasn't a savior. Just a man who hadn't looked away. And maybe that was enough. You ever do something without really knowing why? Not because it's right or wrong, just because you can't not do it? That was Levi in that moment. And for the first time in years, he wasn't the only heartbeat on the land. Not really. And that changed everything.
Sometimes we do things not because we're good, but because we remember what it feels like to be human. Levi didn't carry that man into the barn out of charity. That wasn't his way. He didn't believe in grand gestures, and he sure as hell didn't think of himself as some kind of savior. But when he felt that faint heartbeat beneath cold, dirt-covered skin, something deeper than thought took over. He didn't question it. He just moved. The barn was quiet when he dragged the man inside. Straw rustled underfoot. The mule shifted once, confused, but didn't raise a fuss. Maybe even it sensed something different. Levi lowered the man gently to the dry patch in the back, near the saddle rack. It was the warmest corner of the place. Not by much, but enough. Then he got to work. Boiled water on the old stove, poured out with little whiskey he had left. He hadn't touched it in weeks, maybe months. He pulled a skinning knife from beneath the workbench, wiped off the dust, grabbed some rags, most stained, some torn, and threw them into a basin. There was no ceremony in it, no whisper of prayer, just hands moving with purpose, steady like he'd done it 100 times before. And maybe he had. Maybe not like this, but he'd seen men broken before. Back when uniforms still meant something. Back when blood came quicker than answers. He'd patched wounds in muddy ditches, watched life leave eyes faster than a man could beg to stay. This was different. This man had made it here, somehow, on foot or on luck, maybe both. He wasn't conscious, but something in him had refused to die. And Levi, though he didn't say it out loud, couldn't let that effort go unanswered. He slit the man's vest open, the fabric stiff with old blood. The arrow shaft was broken, but still buried deep. The skin around it was red, inflamed. The smell of infection lingered, sharp and sour. Levi didn't flinch. He dug it out slow, careful. The man twitched once, let out a low groan through cracked lips, then fell quiet again. Blood welled fast, but Levi didn't panic. He poured the whiskey in, quick, brutal. The man's body jolted, arched, then slumped back down. It wasn't clean work. It wasn't heroic, but it was enough. He wrapped the wound tight with whatever cloth he had, pressed hard until the bleeding slowed. When it was over, he sat back, arms heavy, jaw clenched. He didn't feel proud. He felt tired. You ever have a moment like that, where you're just moving because stopping would mean letting something or someone fade out for good? I think a lot of us have. Quiet acts of care we don't talk about, not because they aren't meaningful, but because they came from somewhere deeper than words. When it was done, Levi made a thin cornmeal broth. It wasn't much, just enough to keep a man from starving. He spooned it into the unconscious stranger's mouth, drop by drop. Some stayed down. That night, Levi didn't go back inside. He rolled out a blanket by the barn door, kept the rifle close, built a small fire low to the ground, just enough to cut the cold. And then he watched. Not the man, the dark, the silence. Listened for hooves, for voices, for any sound that meant this man hadn't come alone. But nothing came. 4 days passed like that. Levi worked his land by day, checked the man's bandages by night, never spoke. The man never asked. He was awake sometimes, eyes half open but distant, like his body was here, but the rest of him hadn't caught up. He ate what was given, drank water from Levi's hand, never said a name, never asked a question, and Levi didn't push. Because some stories are worn so raw, even the telling can reopen the wound. He didn't care what war the man had crawled away from. There had been too many. Some started with flags, others started with land, some started with nothing at all but fear passed down like inheritance. Levi had seen enough to know survival doesn't always come with explanations. He didn't ask for help, didn't expect thanks. He just worked, fixed the trough, hauled buckets from the frozen creek when the pump failed again, fed the stock, repaired the saddle that had been sagging for weeks. Each night the man grew a little stronger, and on the 5th morning Levi walked into the barn with a tin of hot beans and found the blanket empty. No note, no tracks, no goodbye. Just a folded bandage laid neatly on top of the saddle blanket. The straw was still warm. Levi stood in the doorway, holding the tin in his hand like he'd forgotten what it was for. Fog still hung low over the pasture. The wind had gone still. And for a long time, he didn't move. He wasn't surprised the man had left. Men like that, ones who come crawling out of some unspeakable place, they don't say thank you. They don't linger. And Levi didn't expect them to. But even as he stood there, watching the empty corral and the fog refusing to lift, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Not regret, not fear, just a quiet weight, like something had begun and wasn't quite finished. He ate alone that morning, same as always. Only this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like the story had more to say, and it was just waiting for the right moment to return.
4 days passed. The man Levi had pulled from the edge of death, he still hadn't said a word. He drank water when it was offered, ate just enough to stay here, eyes half-lidded, never focused, like his body had made it, but the rest of him was still lost somewhere in the trees. And then, one morning, just as the fog was thick enough to hang low over the fence posts, Levi heard hooves. 5 of them. Not the rush of a posse or the heavy stride of ranchers. No shouting, no dust clouds, just the quiet, measured rhythm of horses moving through mist. He stepped onto the porch, coffee still warm in his hand, rifle nearby but untouched. 5 riders emerged from the tree line. All women. They weren't dressed for ceremony or war, no feathers, no painted faces, no banners. They wore leather and wool, practical clothes. Clothes meant for work, not performance. One carried a satchel. Another had a bundle wrapped in hide. Their eyes didn't search for trouble. They scanned the land like they already knew what they were walking into. They stopped in front of the cabin, silent, calm. Then the tallest of them, broad-shouldered and steady-eyed, spoke. "You helped our elder." She didn't thank him. She didn't explain, just stated it plain, like it was fact carved in bark. Levi didn't answer right away. The wind moved behind him. The ranch stretched quiet in all directions. "We came by choice," she said. "We won't take anything. We came to help what needs rebuilding." And that hit different. I mean, what do you do with that? When 5 strangers ride out of the mist and say they didn't come to repay, didn't come to settle a score, but to build. What kind of world do they come from where that's still how things work? Levi looked past them, to the broken fencing, to the collapsed smokehouse, the empty corral, all the things he'd let slide because what was the point in fixing what no one would use? "You don't owe me anything," he said, voice rough from too much silence. The woman nodded. "We didn't come for you. We came for the land." Then they dismounted,
without asking, without waiting, and began walking toward the shed, the barn, the outbuildings, like they already belonged to the place. And Levi, he didn't stop them. He didn't offer directions, didn't hand out nails or rope or reasons, just stood there with his coffee cooling in his hand, wondering what the hell had just begun. By the time the sun burned through the fog, the sound of tools had already returned to the ranch. No shouting, no orders, just work. You ever seen something move without force? Like a river shifting course after a long winter? That's what it felt like. Like the land itself had decided to stop waiting for one man's permission and start growing again. One woman pulled aside old tarps in the barn, checking the saddles. Another began clearing broken branches from around the smokehouse, hatchet swinging low and smooth. The one with the hide bundle unwrapped it by the cabin steps. Strips of cured meat, dried berries, all laid out like an offering. No words, no ceremony. And Levi, he didn't stop them. That's what stuck with me when I first heard this story. They didn't ask, and he didn't object. It's rare, that kind of mutual understanding without conversation. It's even rarer when it's earned through nothing but presence. Levi hadn't invited them, but more importantly, he hadn't sent them away. And maybe that was the start of something bigger than either of them realized. Because these women weren't settlers. They didn't move like people unsure of their place. They weren't here to prove something, and they sure weren't afraid of the work. They moved like they belonged. Not because someone said so, but because the land itself hadn't pushed them out. And in a place that had known nothing but abandonment, silence, and survival, that was enough. That night, Levi didn't light the fire in the house. One of the women already had. The pot on the stove wasn't his doing. The floor had been swept, the oil lamp refilled. There was fresh wood stacked by the door. None of it spoken, none of it owed. It was just done. He sat by the window after dinner, staring out at their small fire beyond the barn. The women wrapped in their own shawls, eating their own meal, not once looking to the house for approval or warmth. And for the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel like a void. It felt like a pause, like breath being held before the next page turns. These women hadn't come to say thank you, hadn't come to repay some imagined debt. They came to rebuild. And somehow, Levi, the man who hadn't asked for help, hadn't let himself need anything since the war, had to decide what kind of man he'd be now that it had arrived. Not in words, but in hands that built, in boots that stayed, in eyes that didn't look away, and in the quiet that began to feel full.
You ever watch a place come back to life? Not all at once, not with noise or fanfare, but in the quiet ways, through movement, through care, through hands that know how to carry weight without asking permission? That's what it was like, watching those 5 women take hold of the ranch. They never asked what needed doing. They just did it. It started with the little things, clearing the smokehouse of the branches that had fallen and stayed fallen for years, fixing the loose gate hinges Levi had meant to get to someday, feeding the horses before first light, brushing the mule's coat so smooth it almost looked like spring again. No one drew up a plan. No one waited for orders. They didn't act like guests, and they sure didn't act like they were passing through. They worked like the land already knew their names. Levi didn't stop them. He didn't quite understand it, but he didn't question it either. Because for the first time in a long while, things were moving. The place was breathing again, and not because of him. Each woman had her rhythm. Ma, the oldest, took to the smokehouse like she'd built it with her own hands, cleaned it out, rebuilt the racks from scratch, hung the venison they'd found at the tree line,
She never spoke much, but her hands were certain, her movements were deliberate. The others watched her without needing her to explain. You could tell she'd led before, somewhere, someone, maybe many someones. Whatever she'd lost, it hadn't stolen the strength from her spine. Tula, quiet but quick, found the sewing box Levi hadn't touched since his mother passed. She mended the saddle blankets, his old coat, the curtains torn at the cabin window. She hummed as she worked, not a tune you'd recognize, just sound to fill the silence, light and steady like a heartbeat. Winona stayed mostly near the shed, started digging a plot with her bare hands, breaking the soil without saying a word. Herbs, maybe, roots, something from her own line, her own knowledge. Her hands stained green, her boots always muddy. She never said where she'd learned the work, but it came from somewhere deep and old. Sawney was harder to read. She didn't work the land like the others. She watched, from the ridge, from the tree line, moving slow because of a limp that looked permanent. But her eyes missed nothing. She scanned the horizon like she expected something to come out of it, and she meant to be the first to see it, maybe to stop it. And then there was Asha. Levi found himself noticing her more than he meant to. She didn't draw attention, didn't lead, but she was everywhere. Feeding horses, mending fence posts, carrying buckets from the creek when the pump froze again. In the morning light, you'd find her sitting by the corral, quiet, eyes fixed on the open land like she was waiting for something, or remembering someone. She spoke little, but when she did, her words had weight. Not heavy, just earned. Levi didn't talk much either, never had. But he found himself looking for reasons to pass near where she worked, bringing a rope that didn't need mending, checking a latch that wasn't broken. He didn't know if she noticed. Or maybe she did, and she just let it be. You ever meet someone who doesn't push to be seen, but somehow you see them anyway? That was Asha. The days began to blur in the best kind of way. The firewood never ran low. The tools were where they belonged. Water buckets were full before Levi reached them. The animals were calmer. The barn smelled like fresh straw again. The cabin, his cabin, felt less like a place to survive and more like a place to return to. No one made announcements. No one asked for credit. They just worked. And Levi, for all his years of doing everything himself, didn't feel the need to reclaim control. He didn't need to. Because what they were building, it wasn't his alone anymore. These women had known pain. You could feel it in their stillness, in their quiet confidence. They didn't come from safety. They came from what they survived. They didn't speak of it, but you could tell. Maybe that's what made their presence feel so solid, so real. They weren't looking to be saved. They weren't looking for shelter. They were looking to begin again, without having to explain why they needed to. And Levi? He was beginning to understand what it meant to let them. Not give permission, but make space. That land, that broken ranch, it had been still for so long, like an old wound scabbed over but never healed. Now it was being stitched together. Not by force, not by ownership, but by hands that had every reason to give up on the world, and hadn't. Sometimes I think we forget the power in quiet resilience, in the kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but shows up every day without fail and picks up what needs to be carried. That's what those women did. And that's how Levi began to change. Not all at once, but in the way he started listening, in the way he started sharing the weight, in the way he started believing the ranch, his silence, was no longer something he had to protect alone. He didn't ask for any of it, but he didn't turn it away. And somehow, that was enough to let something new take root. Some connections don't begin with words. They begin with silence, with the way someone moves through a space without demanding it, with the way their presence doesn't push but settles. That was Asha. Among the 5 women who came to rebuild Levi's land, she was the quietest. Not withdrawn, not cold, just still, like a pond untouched by wind, deceptively calm, holding more than it showed. She never tried to explain herself, never offered stories, but she also never turned away when Levi was near. And that small, almost imperceptible openness, that's where it started. Levi noticed her in the small ways. She was always up before him, feeding the horses before the sun broke over the ridge. He'd walk into the barn half awake, boots barely laced, and there she'd be, brushing down the mare, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a strip of leather from an old saddle. She didn't look up when he entered, not out of dismissal, but because she didn't need to. He started finding excuses to pass by the barn more often, brought tools that didn't need checking, asked about a latch that wasn't broken. She never called him out on it. Maybe she noticed, maybe she didn't, maybe she just let it be. You ever feel drawn to someone not because of what they say, but because of how they don't say it? That was Asha. They didn't talk much, but when they did, the words hung between them like something sacred. Nothing wasted, no space filled out of nervousness, just enough. I remember this one evening. The wind had kicked up hard, and one of the pasture gates had come loose. Levi grabbed his tools and headed out, but by the time he got there, Asha was already crouched beside it, driving a post into the ground with a flat stone, breath fogging in the air, hands raw from the cold. He didn't ask why she was out there. He just knelt beside her and started working. No instructions, no conversation, just 2 people in the dirt, holding something broken together until it stayed. And afterward, she took his coat when he offered, just for a minute, handed it back without a word. They'd walk back to the barn side by side, and that felt like more than enough. Their bond didn't look like much from the outside. There was no confession, no grand exchange. But for people like them, people built on old wounds and quiet endurance, that kind of closeness meant something deeper than anything loud ever could. One night he said, "You don't talk much." She paused in her brushing, looked over her shoulder. "Neither do you." They both smiled, just barely, but it was real. Later he asked if she missed where she came from. She didn't hesitate. There's nothing there to miss. And Levi understood that more than he let on. Because grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from the fact that what you left behind never gave you anything worth holding on to in the first place. Bit by bit, Levi stopped looking over his shoulder the way he used to. He stopped holding his breath when the wind blew from the direction of town, stopped waiting for the sound of hooves that might bring trouble. Because she was there, because they were there, and for the first time in years, he wasn't holding the land up by himself. I think sometimes we expect healing to come with fanfare, with breakthroughs, with dramatic tears and words said at just the right time. But sometimes healing looks like holding a ladder steady while someone else fixes a roof. Sometimes it's offering your coat without asking why they didn't bring one. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in a barn while someone brushes down a horse just so they don't have to be alone. Asha never asked Levi to change, but he did anyway. Not because she demanded it, because she made space for it. He let go of things he hadn't even realized he was clinging to. The war, the weight of silence, the belief that survival meant solitude. And in their quiet connection, something else took shape. Not romance, not obligation, but presence. Trust that didn't need declaring. Belonging that didn't need proof. That's what Asha gave him. That's what they gave each other. And sometimes, when the fire was low and the night hung heavy around the ranch, Levi would sit by the barn door, watching the stars blink between the rafters. No need to speak, no need to move, just breathing the same air and knowing for the first time in a long, long while, he wasn't alone anymore. There's a kind of peace that's so fragile, it doesn't crack, it bruises. You don't hear it break, but you feel it in your chest before the first words even spoken. That's what happened after the women came. At first, it was quiet, just the rustle of new life on old land. Saws against weathered wood, firewood stacked neatly where there hadn't been fire in weeks, rows of herbs taking root where weeds used to be. But peace never goes unnoticed in a place that thrives on suspicion. And the town, small, weathered, built more on habit than hope, it began to talk. It started as whispers at the mercantile. Nothing loud, just glances held a little too long. The old man behind the counter bagging Levi's salt and flour with hands that didn't hide the tremble. "You've got company up there," he said once, like it was a warning, like Levi didn't already know. "Heard they're not white." Just 4 words, but heavy ones, laid down like a trap. Levi didn't answer, didn't nod, just placed the coins on the counter and walked out, boots echoing against the old wood floor louder than they needed to. But silence doesn't stop rumors, and decency doesn't stop fear. It didn't take long before the talk became something else, something aimed. They said Levi had lost his mind, that he'd let wild blood in through the barn door, that the women were squatting, bewitching, corrupting the land, and maybe him too. All the old stories towns like that pull out when something doesn't fit their shape. And then, one day, they came. 3 riders, mid-morning, dust still clinging to their boots, coats faded but not from honest work. The kind of men who believe showing up is a threat in itself. They didn't charge in, didn't yell. They just stopped at the edge of the pasture. Waited. And Levi? He stepped out from the porch, rifle slung but not raised. Asha was beside him. She didn't need to be called. Then Ma, Tula, and Winona, each one standing quiet, firm, just behind the barn doors. Sawney wasn't visible, but Levi knew she was watching. Probably already clocked the riders before the dust even settled. The lead man leaned forward in the saddle, one hand resting on the horn. He wasn't old, but his face carried the look of someone who thought the world owed it its shape. "Been hearing stories," he said, "about a rancher feeding folks that don't belong." Levi didn't blink. "You must be lost." Another man chuckled, low, rehearsed. "We're not here to start anything," the first said. "Just figured maybe it's time you cleared this place out. Start fresh before things get tangled." Asha stepped forward. "We're not leaving." He narrowed his eyes. "Wasn't talking to you." Then Mika's voice cut through like stone. "Then you shouldn't have come here." Tula lifted her chin. Calm. Solid. The man shifted in his saddle again. He hadn't expected this much weight. Definitely not from women. Certainly not from Levi, the man they had all thought lived off bitterness and bones. And maybe that's what shook him the most. Levi finally spoke, voice low. "You've seen what we've done here. You know damn well it's more than you've done on your own land. You think a few threats will undo that? You don't understand the people you're dealing with." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't a warning, it was a boundary. And the man must have known it, because his eyes shifted. He clicked his tongue, turned the horse, didn't say a word. The others followed. They didn't look back. And Levi? He stood there until the dust settled, until the silence returned. Not the silence of fear, the kind that settles after you've stood your ground and didn't flinch.
But that night, no one celebrated. No fire burned brighter. No toasts were raised. They ate quietly, passed the stew, shared the warmth like they always did. And in the hush of that evening, Levi sat by the window, looking out across the land they'd rebuilt together. He said, "They'll talk." Asha didn't look away. "They already are. You think they'll come back?" She paused. "Maybe, but we're not moving." And that's the thing about standing your ground. It's never really about winning. It's about choosing to stay even when the world starts turning against you. It's about saying, "We belong not because you allow it, but because we do the work." And for Levi, who'd spent years thinking belonging meant solitude, that kind of resistance felt more powerful than any rifle he'd ever held.
Some choices don't come loud. They don't kick down your door or grab you by the collar. They just arrive. Quiet, steady, like a hand resting on your shoulder, waiting to see which way you'll lean. Levi had always been a man who stood alone, not because he didn't need people, but because at some point he'd stopped believing they'd stay. And when that happens enough times, solitude doesn't feel like a prison, it feels like protection. But this time, something was different. After those riders came and left, after the dust settled and the fence line held, Levi stood on his porch and watched the women work like they always had, clearing brush, feeding stock, mending what needed mending. No one acted like anything had changed, but something had. He felt it, in the air, in the way they didn't look to him for reassurance, in the way he didn't need to offer any. That night, as the sun dropped low and the shadows stretched long across the pasture, Levi called them in. All 5. They stood around the fire pit. No chairs, no distance. Just boots in the dirt and eyes waiting. He didn't pace, didn't rehearse, just breathed deep and spoke. "You've done more for this place than I have in 3 years, he said. "I didn't ask for it, but I see it now. I know what you're building." The fire popped once, soft, like it was listening too. "There are folks," he continued, "who might come out here, might think what we have is wrong, might think you don't belong, that I'm a fool for letting it happen." He looked up, met each of their eyes, one by one, steady, unapologetic. "If they come here thinking I'll stand aside, they're wrong." It was the first time he'd said it out loud. Not just to them, to himself. Mika folded her arms. Tula tilted her head. Sonny gave the slightest nod. Winona didn't blink. Then his eyes found Asha. He hesitated for half a breath, then said it plain. "You're not guests. You're not just passing through. If you want to stay, you stay. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay..." He stepped forward, closer to the circle of firelight. "I stand with you, every damn step of it." And right then, something in the air changed. Not heavy, not dramatic, just settled, like the ground had accepted the weight of that promise. Asha looked at him, long, quiet, not with surprise, more like confirmation. Then she stepped in, just close enough for her shadow to brush his. "We already stayed. We just waited to see if you would." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The others didn't speak. They didn't need to either. Because sometimes when you build something with your hands and your breath and your days, the words aren't what seal it. The doing is. Later that night, they shared a meal. Not out of ritual, not out of celebration, just because food needed eating and they were there, together. No one called it a family. No one had to. But Levi felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been there in years. A weight, yes, but a chosen one. Not loneliness, not survival, something else. Responsibility,
not as a burden, but as a bond. I remember once hearing someone say that belonging isn't about being accepted, it's about being claimed and choosing to claim back. That night, Levi didn't look out across his land the same way. It wasn't just soil anymore, not just fences and stock and memory. It was a place where people had decided to stay, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they'd found something worth defending. And now, so had he.
Sometimes, before danger shows its face, it leaves small things behind. A broken twig, a hoof print turned the wrong way, a horse that spooks for no reason, a silence in the trees that used to be filled with birds. That's how it began. They didn't ride in with guns drawn, not yet, but the land started whispering warnings. One morning, Levi found a section of the north fence sawed clean through. Not torn, not broken by weather, but cut, precise, like someone had taken their time, like they wanted to remind him, "We know where you are." He stood there for a long while, fingers running over the wood, breath slow. No boot prints near the cut, just the absence of tracks where there should have been some, which is its own kind of message. Later that day, Tula found a rabbit carcass laid at the foot of the smokehouse, not torn apart by a predator, not hunted for food, just left, gutted, arranged. A message in blood and silence. By the creek, the horses were jittery. Sani found one of them limping, a thin slice near the hock, not deep enough to kill, just enough to send a message, "We can reach what you care about." And on the third morning, Winona came back from the ridge carrying something wrapped in cloth. She didn't say a word, just placed it on the table. Inside, a bundle of sage, blackened at the tips, scorched. Not something from their own hands. Something left. Something meant to unsettle. You ever feel your body know a threat before your mind catches up? That weight in your stomach? That itch between your shoulders? The way you start locking doors you never used to. That's how the ranch felt now. The work didn't stop. The animals still needed tending. The days still brought sun and dust and wind. But underneath all of it, tension, quiet, heavy. Like the land itself was holding its breath. And so, they prepared. No speeches, no panic, just motion. Levi walked the perimeter with Sani, checking the fence line, mapping the soft ground where strangers might pass. They reinforced weak points with sharpened stakes, dug small trenches that wouldn't stop a full charge, but would buy time. Food was divided, some stored deep in the cellar, the rest hidden under floorboards and brush piles. Tula and Asha hashing trip lines from horsehair and wire. Not traps, just signals, warnings, so they'd know when the dark came with more than night. Guns were checked, cleaned, ammunition counted. Not much, but enough for one stand. Asha sharpened a knife that had belonged to her grandmother. Levi watched her do it. Long, slow strokes against stone. Not rushed, not angry, just certain. He asked her, softly, "You think they'll come?" She didn't pause. "They already have. They're just waiting to see if we'll run." And that's what it was about, wasn't it? Fear. Not theirs, but the kind others feel when they see something they can't control. A man who doesn't flinch, women who don't ask permission. A patch of land being brought back to life by people who weren't supposed to survive. And maybe that's the real threat, not the rifles or the knives or the fire, but the idea that healing could happen here, that something sacred could grow in the ashes. I remember once, years ago, camping out in a high meadow with my grandfather. We heard coyotes that night, close. He didn't grab his gun, didn't build a fire, just sat by the rocks and said, It's not the sound that should scare you. It's when they go quiet. The ranch had gone quiet now, but no one ran. They built their defense not out of rage, but love. Not out of vengeance, but belonging. Each act of preparation wasn't about fear. It was a form of commitment. To the land, to each other, to the truth that they had already been through worse, and they were still standing. Levi sat up late that night, alone on the porch, watching the dark settle in like a slow tide. The stars blinked through the clouds, indifferent and ancient. He sipped his coffee, lukewarm now, but it steadied his hand. He didn't pray. He didn't plan a fight. He just sat there, rifle resting beside him, eyes on the tree line, waiting. Not for war, but for the choice the others would make, to destroy or to leave. And either way, he was ready.
It wasn't a surprise when they showed up. After all the signs, the fence cut clean, the animals wounded, the silence thickening like storm clouds, it was only a matter of time. Violence rarely walks in unannounced. It sends whispers first. They came at dawn. 3 at first, then 6, all on horseback, moving like they'd rehearsed it. Riders wrapped in dust and tension, boots heavy with the weight of self-righteousness. Men who believed the land should answer to them because it always had. Levi was already outside when they crested the hill. He'd slept with his boots on, rifle close. Not because he was scared, but because this was the kind of morning that didn't allow sleep. The riders didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was the statement. Behind Levi, the door to the cabin creaked open. One by one, the women stepped out. Not hurried, not afraid, just present, fully. Tula, with her sleeves rolled, calloused hands steady at her sides. Winona, silent, eyes sharp. Ma, with her back straight like memory had forged her into something unbreakable. Sunny, standing still, but you could feel the fire behind her gaze. And Asha. Asha didn't say a word. She just moved to stand beside Levi, shoulder to shoulder, not behind him. It's strange how quiet confrontation can be. No wind, no birdsong, just breath and boots shifting in dry dirt. The man in front, same one from before, the one with too much confidence and not enough patience, looked down from his saddle. "We gave you time," he said, "tried to be decent." Levi didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man glanced at the women. "You still got a chance," he said. "Tell them to go. We'll ride off. No harm done." There was a long pause. Long enough to hear the flap of tarp from the barn, the creak of leather as horses shifted. Levi stepped forward, just once. "You think this is still mine to decide?" The man blinked, confused. "This isn't my land anymore. It's ours. If you want it, you're going to have to take it from all of us." Another rider muttered something under his breath. The leader raised a hand, silencing him. "You're siding with them over your own kind?" Asha finally spoke. "He's siding with his kind. People who stay when it's hard, who build instead of burn. You just don't recognize us because we don't kneel." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. You could feel it land. And suddenly, it wasn't 6 men against 1. It was 6 against something far older, far stronger. 6 against a wall made not of timber, but of bond. And that kind of wall doesn't crack under threat. I remember once hearing, "Real power doesn't have to shout. It just stands." That's what Levi and the women did that morning. No raised rifles, no blood, just presence, just truth. The man on horseback looked at them, really looked, and for the first time you could see it in his face. This wouldn't end like he'd planned. He thought he was walking into weakness. Instead, he found something immovable. They weren't armed to the teeth. They didn't look like soldiers, but they were a unit, and that scared him more than guns ever could. He clicked his tongue, turned his horse. The others hesitated, then followed. No shots fired. No last threats. Just the sound of hooves fading into the hills. And still, no one cheered. No one dropped their guard, because the fight they'd won wasn't about muscle. It was about ownership, of self, of land, of choice. Later that day, they patched the barn roof, cut firewood, took turns at the creek, like always. But something had shifted. Levi sat on the porch that evening, legs stretched, mug of coffee cooling in his hand. Asha passed by on her way to the coop, paused, looked at him. "Are you okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah." And after a moment he added, "Didn't think I'd ever stand for anything again, let alone with people." She smiled, soft, knowing. "You didn't stand for people. You stood with them. That's the difference." And there, under the weight of a sky turning gold with dusk, Levi realized the truth. Strength isn't about holding ground. It's about sharing it. And when you stand with people who refuse to bend, not out of hate, but because they've known too much loss to allow one more, there's nothing in the world that can shake you.
There are some victories you don't celebrate out loud, not because they don't matter, but because they're earned in silence. Weeks passed, maybe more. Time started slipping again, the way it does when nothing bleeds, and no one came back. No horses on the ridge, no offerings left in the dirt, no more cut fences or bruised animals or words wrapped in threat. The town went quiet too. Rumors have short breath when they meet proof that won't bend. And the ranch? The ranch began to breathe differently. I remember this feeling once, after a storm, when the power came back on and the fridge hummed again. That low, forgotten sound of something working like it should. Not glorious, not dramatic, just steady. That's what it felt like out there. The hens began laying again, full baskets, warm shells tucked into hay like offerings to a world that had almost forgotten how to be gentle. Tula rebuilt the roosting boxes with leftover planks from the barn repair. She didn't say anything about it, just worked until the hinges swung clean. The vegetable patch. Remember that patch Aisha had planted by hand? It was full now, green and stubborn. Tomatoes, beets, something leafy no one quite had a name for, but it fed them just the same. Winona fixed the water pump, not just patched, but fully running. She'd pulled the whole thing apart, oiled it, resealed it, cursed at it once or twice under her breath, and then smiled when it sputtered to life. Even the mules looked happier. It's funny how animals know peace before we do. They stopped flinching at shadows, started standing closer to the house at night. And Levi? Well, Levi began to live like a man who belonged again. He didn't talk about the day the riders came, didn't need to. He took over feeding in the mornings, checking the fence line before coffee, always whistling, low and rough, but steady. That kind of whistle that comes from a chest not knotted in fear anymore. Some evenings he'd sit on the porch with Asha, boots up, eyes on the sky. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Sometimes the deepest peace is shared in silence.
And here's the thing. No one ever declared it safe. No one drew a line and said, "It's over now." Because it wasn't about winning. It was about continuing. You ever feel that? That moment where life stops asking, "Can you survive?" and starts whispering, "What will you build?" That's where they were. The ranch wasn't just standing, it was growing. A place that had once been a grave for one man's solitude was now a gathering point, a patchwork sanctuary held together by effort and loss and choice. There was no ceremony, no flag raised, no townfolk coming to apologize, just crops that needed tending, water that needed carrying, and meals that were shared without needing to be earned. And isn't that the better kind of victory? Not the kind shouted from rooftops, but the kind that sinks into dirt, takes root, feeds something. So when people ask, what happened to Levi Boone? What happened to that quiet ranch out near the canyon edge? You tell them, it lived. Not because it fought, but because it held. Because people stayed. Because when they could have run, they planted seeds instead. When they could have hated, they built instead. And when no one believed they'd survive together, they did. And maybe that's the story we need more of now. Not the ones about heroes who save the world, but the ones about people who stay and choose, day by day, to make a little piece of it better.
There's a moment. If you've ever lived through real change, you'll know it. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It doesn't knock on the door. It just settles in, soft as dust on a windowsill. And one day, without meaning to, you notice something different in yourself. Not louder, not braver, just more open. That's what began to happen on the ranch. After the danger passed, and the hens laid steady again, and the pump gave clean water like it had never broken, something else started to mend. Something you couldn't point to with your hand, but you felt it, and how the women laughed, lighter now, and how they sat closer around the fire, and how no one looked over their shoulder at night. One evening, Sonny brought out a fiddle she hadn't touched in years. She played a song she only half remembered, something slow and bent with time. Tula clapped along. Winona hummed. Even Ma, who rarely showed anything, let a smile flicker across her face like an ember that didn't quite go out. And Asha, she didn't speak much more than before, but her silence was different. Not guarded, rooted, like the way trees listen. And when Levi looked at her now, he didn't see the outline of someone trying to survive. He saw someone choosing to stay. I remember this one night. The moon was low, the stars were loud. Levi had just come in from mending a fence gate that didn't really need fixing. And the house was warm with the smell of stew and sweat and quiet work. He sat at the old pine desk in the corner, pulled out a notebook he hadn't touched in 3 years. The leather cover still smelled of the storm it once rode through. He opened it, the pages stiff with dust and time. And then he wrote. Just one line. No sermon, no apology, no sweeping wisdom. Only this. They have stayed. That was it. But it said everything. Because for a man like Levi, who'd built walls high enough to block out entire seasons, to pick up a pen, to write that, meant something had shifted where no one could see. And maybe that's how healing works. Not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent truths. A pot shared. A fence mended side by side. A moment of laughter that doesn't feel borrowed. You ever feel that way? Like a part of you was frozen for so long you forgot it could thaw?
Then one day, someone looks at you, not like they want to fix you, but like they're willing to sit beside you. Not leave, not judge, just stay. That's what these women did. For themselves, for each other, for the land, for Levi. And slowly, like spring rising out of hard ground, Levi did the same. He laughed more now, not big, not loud, but enough. Enough to make the horses twitch their ears. Enough to make Ma roll her eyes like a mother who secretly likes her child's joke. He carved a wooden spoon for Winona, fixed a broken hinge Sonny had stopped mentioning, learned the names of each plant Asha had brought back from the woods. He was still quiet, still Levi, but now he looked people in the eye. And that ranch, it wasn't just a patch of dirt anymore. It was a place rebuilt by people who had every reason to disappear and didn't. A place where trust wasn't asked for, it was grown. A place where the old pain still lived, yes, but so did hope. And it all came back to one sentence, written late at night by a man who once believed he would die alone. They have stayed. And because they stayed, he did too. And maybe that's the real story. Not the fear, not the fight, but what comes after. The quiet decision to remain.
And everything it begins to change.
There's a difference between being alone and feeling alone. And Levi Boone, for the longest time, he didn't just live alone, he wore it. Like a second skin, like armor. That old ranch, with its peeling fences and sagging beams, had once been a place for silence, not safety. It echoed with things unsaid, memories too loud to chase out. And Levi, he never expected more. Didn't ask for warmth or laughter or voices that stayed after sundown. But slowly, almost without him noticing, something shifted. It wasn't just the roof that stopped leaking, or the hens laying again. It wasn't the repaired pump or the vegetables green and proud in the dirt. It was something softer, quieter, but more permanent. It was the way the kitchen stayed warm long after supper, the way muddy boots stacked 2 by 2 on the porch, the way Winona would leave dried herbs on the windowsill just because it made the place smell like care. It was the laughter drifting out from the barn in the afternoon, rough, tired, real. And one night, while stacking firewood behind the cabin, Levi paused, just stood there, hands still, the weight of the logs forgotten. He could hear Asha humming something low, Tula chopping something in the kitchen, Sonny fixing a latch on the coop, muttering to herself. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt it. Not safety, not just survival. Belonging. You ever felt that? That moment where you're not just passing through a place, but part of it. Where the people around you aren't just neighbors or names, but threads in your own story. It's not loud. It doesn't come with ceremony. It comes with continuity, with shared coffee, with silent glances that say, "I see you." With doors left unlocked and hands that know what to do without asking. And that old ranch, it wasn't haunted anymore. It was held. The land had new roots now, not just in the soil, but in the people who tended it. A place once marked by emptiness had become a sanctuary, not because it was perfect, not because it was protected, but because it was chosen, over and over again, by every woman who stayed, by every seed that took, by every morning someone got up and showed up. And Levi, he'd changed too. He still didn't say much,
still sat with his back to the wall sometimes, still watched the tree line like it might move. But there was something different in the way he carried the buckets now. The way he spoke Asha's name. The way he didn't flinch when Sani bumped his shoulder in passing. And one morning, early, just before the sun peeled back the frost, he stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, looked out at the land stretching soft and quiet before him, chickens murmuring in their coop, smoke curling from the chimney, Tula laughing inside at something Ma had said. He closed his eyes, breathed in, and whispered just to himself, "This is home." Not a house, not a structure, but home. Because that's what happens when you stop trying to protect yourself from everything and start letting some of it in. That's what happens when people come not to fix you, but to be with you. And maybe in the end, that's what we're all looking for. Not perfection, not peace that never gets interrupted, but a place where our silence still has a seat at the table, where we can be exactly who we are and still be welcomed. And for Levi Boone, the man who once tried to outrun connection across miles of dust and quiet, he had found it. He didn't just live there now, he belonged.